Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode.
The message is very simple. 6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Turn on, tune in, drop out. For this crowd of hip young Americans, these 6 words are shorthand for an electrifying experience most of them know well, an experience called the trip. The trip is a drug-induced mental explosion that has changed their whole way of looking at the world. But for many other Americans, the 6 words stand for something else: controversy, crime, and terror. Turning on, tuning in, and dropping out is what happens to you when you take a dose of the strange new drug called LSD.
They say that if you can remember the 1960s, you weren't really there. Whether that's strictly true or not, it was an era of experimentation as a revolution in sex, drugs and rock and roll got underway. And when it comes to psychedelic drugs, there was one undisputed guru, Timothy Leary.
The key to religion, the key to find God is intelligence. It's not obedience. It's not submission. It's not falling on your knees. What's wrong with you falling on your knees? Do you worship a God that wants you on your knees like slaves? The new religions are going to glorify intelligence. A third of the people that listen to this broadcast are going to think it over and are going to take some steps in self-actualization and throwing out the 2,000 or 3,000 year old heritage of submission and fear and guilt and sin and devil and all that nonsense, which is designed to keep you stupid and to keep you frightened.
Leary was the person who coined the phrase that defined 1960s counterculture: turn on, tune in, drop out. Writer Phil Cotnoir told me about Timothy Leary's cult status.
Timothy Leary is a professor. He's a gifted rhetorician. He's able to kind of capture the spirit of the moment in his sort of pithy saying. He becomes kind of the figurehead of this, and he's encouraging everyone. Basically, it's being presented as this is the way to open your consciousness, this is the way to open your mind, this is the way to get perspective on not only your life, but the nature of reality and the universe. But at the time, there was a lot of momentum to the idea that young people were rejecting the framework offered to them by their parents and were turning to these substances to have just a really mind-opening experience.
Before he got to Harvard, he had an experience with mushrooms in Mexico.
This is psychedelics advocate Rick Doblin telling Leary's story to Lex Friedman.
And that, he said, he learned more in that experience than he'd had in his entire academic career before then about how the human mind works. Mm-hmm. And so he came to Harvard wanting to do research into psychedelics. And he did some very important studies, both of which, one was called the Good Friday experiment, which was whether psychedelics in religiously inclined people taking psilocybin in a religious setting, whether it could produce a mystical experience. That took place at Marsh Chapel at Boston University.
Timothy Leary's Good Friday experiment in 1962 investigated the effects of psilocybin on religious experiences. Conducted at Harvard, the study involved theology students taking the hallucinogenic drug during a Good Friday service. This is one of the participants reflecting years later.
Everything in the world just seemed to glow inwardly with life. Everything was alive, and I don't mean just living things, but even inanimate things. They just lived. The experience that day demonstrated to me the reality of God's presence in all the world and in all experience. If our eyes are opened and we are able to perceive and take that in. And by eyes, I mean our spiritual inner awarenesses.
In fact, in a 25-year follow-up to Leary's famous experiment, all of the subjects, except for one, described their experience as having elements of a genuine mystical nature and described it as one of the high points of their spiritual life. But as Leary's fame spread, so did controversy.
And various musicians and artists and all sorts of people started coming to him for the psychedelic experience that they are, in a way, for creativity, for other things. So he started hanging out with all sorts of famous people or creative people, and he stopped going to classes a lot. And Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, had given LSD to a student that Ram Dass was courageous enough to admit that he had sexual interest in. Mm-hmm. They weren't supposed to give it undergraduates. That was about the only time that they ever did it. And psychedelics just getting more and more controversial, even in the early 60s. Eventually he got kicked out of Harvard, and then he became kind of a cultural icon for the counterculture.
I urge all of you to go back to your campuses and start some type of dropout movement. That's the only way we're going to bring this country of menopausal, whiskey-drinking congressmen, senators, and so forth to their senses. And when I mean their senses, I mean their senses.
Leary's provocative influence on the student hippie movement and the growing resistance to the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War put him on a collision course with the authorities.
And it becomes very threatening to the powers that be. I mean, Richard Nixon called Leary the most dangerous man in America.
This is journalist Michael Pollan on The Big Think.
He felt that LSD and other drugs were sapping the will of American boys to fight in Vietnam, and he may well have been right. I mean, LSD encourages people to think for themselves, to not accept the frames of social values, the games that we play socially. And in important ways, LSD did fuel the counterculture and was very threatening to adult society and to the powers that be. By the end of the decade, they're made illegal. Schedule I drug beginning in 1970. The research gradually atrophies and dies by the mid-70s, early 70s, which is unprecedented in science, that you would have this incredibly promising avenue of inquiry, scientific inquiry, that's stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with the science.
The criminalization of the drugs effectively saw the movement go underground for a long time. But in recent years, hallucinogens have re-entered the mainstream in a big way. The Eastern-infused teachings of Leary's psychedelic peers in the 60s, such as Ram Dass and Alan Watts, have been given a new life on popular podcasts, and some of the biggest influences in the world are on board.
Would you be comfortable sharing some of your own psychedelic experiences?
Sure. I mean, the DMT experiences are by far the most profound.
This is podcast host Joe Rogan describing how experiencing psychedelics turned him onto some kind of spiritual dimension.
Every time I've done it, it's just completely made me rethink how I interface with people, what life is, and what that experience, what is that? Is that a well of souls you're entering into? Is it another dimension? Is it some sort of parallel dimension of disembodied consciousness that you seem to be engaging with life forms, with things that know you, that can see your thoughts? Every time I've done it, it's sort of just like, in one way or another, just removed one layer of the onion that keeps you from just embracing the great mystery of this existence.
It's not just Joe Rogan rhapsodizing about the benefits of psychedelics. Hundreds of celebrities and influencers have increasingly been advocating for their use, and there's a booming tourist market on the ayahuasca trail for those looking for the indigenous roots of hallucinogens. Meanwhile, clinical trials are increasingly trumpeting the benefits of psilocybin as a medical antidote to depression and other mental health conditions. The booming interest in psychedelics also seems to go hand in hand with the modern search for meaning. Timothy Leary's hopes for a new psychedelic-fueled religion in the 1960s may have been shut down, but 60 years on, in our thoroughly post-Christian materialist culture, long starved of religious experience, it seems that the tide of faith may be coming back in all kinds of unusual ways. Many modern devotees say that psychedelics has shattered their atheism and opened up their mind to God. But as we'll hear in today's show, not everyone chasing enlightenment ends up finding it.
I lay down on the floor and I said to my husband, like, I really am dying this time. Like, I'm dying. I'm dying this time. And I said, does anything mean anything? And he said, yes, everything has meaning. And I started crying. And I remember at one point, I felt like I was chasing after God. I was pacing around our house and I felt like I was chasing after God and I just kept missing him. And there was such a sorrowful, like his robes were whisking around the corner. And there was such a sorrowful feeling in it. And I was devastated, but I was also, after that, I was fully ready to move on.
Today, as we conclude our act on mind, meaning and materialism, we'll hear Ashley Lande's surprising rebirth story and whether the renaissance of psychedelics is a real route to spiritual nirvana. I'm Justin Brierley, and throughout my working life, I've been hosting conversations on faith between atheists, agnostics, and believers. In this documentary series, I'm telling the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. I'm speaking to those inside and outside the atheist movement and the many thinkers beginning a new conversation on the value of faith. Along the way, we'll meet some of those who have found themselves surprised by God as they've made the journey from atheism to Christianity. Welcome to the surprising rebirth of belief in God, episode 26, Psychedelics and the Search for God. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Take a seat either in a chair or cross-legged on a cushion, and gradually become aware of the sensations of sitting. Feelings of pressure in your back or legs. Feel your arms at your sides, and perhaps take a few deep breaths. And allow gravity to settle you into your seat. Notice where you feel the breath most distinctly, either at the tip of the nose or in the rising and falling of your abdomen.
This is Sam Harris. He made his name as one of the so-called four horsemen of new atheism in the early 2000s, but in recent years he's reinvented himself as a mindfulness guru. On his popular Waking Up app, Harris provides guided meditations to aid relaxation and sleep and provides mental health advice for those wanting to conquer anxiety and depression. As we've explored in previous episodes, I believe Harris is one of a number of figures who have recognised that New Atheism's promise of a harmonious future ruled by science and reason has not materialised. Instead, a meaning crisis, accelerated by technology and tribalism, has led to a mental health crisis. Many people are choosing to drop out of real life altogether and live in an online world of their own making. Harris is in good company in his new phase as a mindfulness mentor. With the waning of the New Atheist movement's star intellectuals, a new set of gurus have emerged, the social media, psychology, diet, and wellness influencers.
When during the day do you typically tend to be most alert? That will afford you an advantage, so don't give up that period of time for things that are meaningless, useless, or not aligned with your goals.
Time is the currency we're playing with in every moment of our lives. It's the center point of our influence. If you spend 8 hours sleeping, you wake up with 16 chips left. And how you place those chips on this roulette table that sits in front of us, just before the wheel spins every day, determines all of our outcomes in our lives.
Because if I fail one of these 1 seconds, I will not be a SEAL. I will not be a doctor. I will not be a lawyer. I will not be whatever the it is.
That framing that we place around the present moment largely determines our experience of it. And I find myself trying to live for future Chris more. And the more that I do that, the better that my life seems to get.
I'm grateful that there's a growing acceptance of the reality of mental illness.
Author Alan Noble.
The flip side to that, you mentioned these, self-appointed gurus. They have a kind of hustle, grind, achievement mindset, constant self-improvement that I think is the flip side to those who are dropping out. And in You Are Not Your Own, I call these two groups the resigned, those who have dropped out and just believe life just fundamentally doesn't work. It's the game is rigged. I can't function. And then the affirming, those who affirm that, you know what, I am my own and I can carry these burdens and I can function. I think there are a lot of self-appointed gurus on Instagram, on YouTube, who are feeding particularly young men, but not exclusively, these images of high achievement, excellence, promotion, self-promotion, these sorts of things, trying to convince them that their problem is that you're just not trying hard enough. And if they just try harder, life will be fulfilling. And, ultimately, we know this from highly successful people, that success is not fulfilling, that success does not satisfy us. There's always that, back to that excess again, there's something more that's needed.
Noble's recent book, On Getting Out of Bed in the Morning, The Burden and Gift of Living, details how we are self-medicating in various ways to deal with the pressures of modern life. Little wonder then that psychedelics are making a return. Sam Harris, speaking here on The Big Think, has been open about how his early experiences with MDMA, also known as ecstasy, influenced him.
Before it became a club drug, I think this was in 1987, I took it as a means of discovering something about the nature of my mind. It was not a social situation. I was just, a friend and I were alone, and we took it together and just had a conversation on this drug. And the crucial component of this was a loss of any feeling of self-concern. I was no longer looking at myself through my friend's eyes. I was no longer worried about what he was thinking about me. I was no longer subtly correcting course based on changes I saw in how he was perceiving what I was saying. And I was not in the habit of thinking about how much I loved the men in my life. And here's one of my best friends. And I just realized with it sounds absolutely pedestrian to say it, but I realized that I wanted him to be happy in a way that was just, it was like a lightning bolt, and that suddenly opened my mind to the possibility of being like Jesus, whoever he was. Some people historically and even in the present have borne witness to this experience where you can just quite literally lose your self-concern in a way that makes you love people unconditionally.
Harris credits his belief in the power of meditation to his experiences with psychedelics.
And the truth is, virtually any experience you can have with psychedelics, you can have without psychedelics, because all psychedelics do is modulate the existing neurochemistry of the brain. They're not doing something that the brain can't do on its own. You're just playing with neurotransmitters or mimicking neurotransmitters. I have had the same experience to more or less similar degree just through meditation, but it's clear to me that I would never have suspected that such an experience was possible but for my experimenting with MDMA in the beginning, and so I have to just acknowledge that.
In our docuseries, we've recently explored the way atheistic assumptions have dominated thinking about the mind, and Harris is clearly still in the reductive physicalism camp, believing that our conscious experiences, including those created by meditation and psychedelics, are purely products of brain chemistry. Interestingly, not all his peers are heading in the same direction. In our last episode, we introduced mind and body researcher Christoph Koch, who lost a 25-year-old bet against philosopher David Chalmers on whether neuroscience could conquer the question of consciousness. Perhaps Koch's willingness to concede defeat was influenced by the fact that he has begun very recently to talk in very different terms about consciousness. Speaking here on the Phidias podcast, he explained how psychedelics have been central to his change of mind.
Although I've studied consciousness for 40 years, I've only come to these substances late in life, and they were very powerful experiences. And one where it was I had a near-death experience where I took a heroic dose, and everything disappears, and it taught me a lot. Myself disappeared, my body disappeared, space disappeared, time disappeared, the perception of the flow of time disappeared. There was just a visual, there was bright light and terror and ecstasy. What it taught me, once again, the primacy of consciousness. There was no world, there's nothing physical anymore. Everything was just pure mental. But there was this mental thing. So consciousness is really central to our existence. And then, I try to understand now, what does it tell me? What does it reveal? What does it tell me? And how can I fit this into my view of the physical and the mental? Because, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to have a singular understanding of everything in the universe. And so that's why, I'm thinking, well, maybe physicalism, maybe consciousness is really the only thing ultimately there is, which is a closer position to idealism than I used to be.
So you are moving slightly to that direction because of your metaphysical experience with this stuff, or because of your intellectual thinking?
No, primarily it's the experience.
Interesting.
I mean, it's the experience. The experience is, is real. It's more real. I mean, you feel, right, that you've come, finally, this is it. This is real reality. This is, I call it hyper-realization. This is what really is the case. Everything else is sort of a representation. It's a distant mirror. It's a distant image of the real thing. But now I see the real thing. Yeah. And then you try to use your intellect and my science, etc., to see, well, how can I fit this in? And one explanation would be a form of analytic idealism.
The changed perspective that psychedelics can bring is even more pronounced for some.
When I did the psychedelics, that was the first time I realized there's a lot more going on than what we see.
This is former Navy SEAL Shawn Ryan being interviewed by his wife, Katie Jean.
Before you even did psychedelics, you must have been thinking, there's got to be something else. There's got to, maybe by doing psychedelics might open my mind to more spirituality, religion, God, Jesus. You know what I mean? Was there any of that, or were you looking for...
After psychedelics?
Before psychedelics.
Before psychedelics, being 100% honest, the first time I did psychedelics, it completely changed everything. Mm-hmm. I was wrong this entire time. There is no God, and then I did psychedelics. What I experienced there was I realized there was a lot more going on in the universe around us that we don't see. And that's what really sparked my curiosity into figuring out, all right, How did we get here? What is the higher power? You know, all that kind of stuff.
Ryan is now a successful podcast host with over 2.5 million subscribers to his YouTube channel. But at Easter this year, he surprised his large audience when he released a video of his baptism.
Confession in Scripture is very important, which is that we believe Jesus is our Lord and He's risen from the dead. That's out of Romans 10. He says, those who say Jesus is Lord and believe in their hearts that He's risen from the dead, they are saved. And so, Shawn, do you believe Jesus is your Lord and that He's been raised from the dead?
Yes, I do.
It's because of your confession of faith in Jesus that I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Ryan explained how, following his experience with psychedelics and despite being up to that point a tough atheistic war veteran, he became emotionally open to the idea of faith and started attending church.
Got emotional in the church all 5 times. Every time we walk in there, I feel like I'm going to lose it in a good way. You know, I don't know what it is. It just makes me want to cry. But it feels good. And I still fight it, you know, because I just don't know any other way. But it feels good. I started reading the Bible and started looking for answers, started watching documentaries, reading the Bible, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be here talking about this right now. And maybe this will give some other people some hope. Maybe this will get some other people to start looking into this.
Phil Cotnoir is a freelance writer whose popular article, The Coming Psychedelic Moment, for the Mere Orthodoxy website, began by examining the surprising conversion of Shawn Ryan. I sat down with Cotnoir to talk about it.
Shawn Ryan's an interesting case study because when I was listening to him, his story brought together 3 streams in my own thinking, which are usually apart, but which I was wanting to explore a little bit more. And so those streams are the current mental health crisis. Shawn Ryan was a Navy SEAL, a combat veteran, and like so many of those men, came back with some mental scars and difficulties and just struggling so much to adjust to civilian life and family life. And so in that community of veterans, there are some promising results medically that have been shown that psychedelics can help with people suffering from PTSD. And we can get into why that would be the case. But basically, he goes and has some psychedelic experiences and psychedelic therapy, and it's a transformative experience for him. It really helps him in his struggle, helps him get perspective on his life. And it also sets him on a kind of spiritual quest as it opens up his mind and heart to spiritual questions and realities that had just not been part of his thinking for a long time. So then he goes on to have a successful podcast. And so then he eventually turns to Christ and in his words, returns to the church and finds there a community of people that he can feel a part of. Now, I don't know Shawn. I don't know the genuineness of his conversion. But that trajectory from mental health struggle to looking to psychedelics for some kind of relief, and then a kind of spiritual journey that ends in Christianity, I find that very interesting, and it's not the first time I've come across that trajectory. So it was something I wanted to introduce the piece with, and then explore those themes a little more.
Give us a sense of why it has become such a talking point, why so many people are looking at the benefits of hallucinogens, psychedelics and so on. Joe Rogan, for instance, has had a lot of people on his very well listened to podcast talking about it, and just feels like it's come back into the public consciousness in a way. What's kind of behind that, do you think?
Absolutely. That's part of how I first sort of started hearing about it, listening to Joe Rogan or others and just seeing it everywhere, and then meeting people at my church who had
come to Christ in dramatic ways out of that whole scene. You know, I think drawing on your own work, Justin, and the meaning crisis afflicting the West, the way that I've been looking at it to make sense of it is to see that, you know, the rise of materialism, atheism really drained out the meaning and the richness of one's experience of life, right? When those core assumptions about the fact that we are just matter floating around in a meaningless universe, when that really sinks down into your lived experience, it is a rather bleak and hopeless thing. And I think there's a real hunger for the transcendent that then just wells up because of the image of God inside each person. And so that's manifesting itself in many different ways as our culture sort of now washes back towards belief from the receding tide of faith. Psychedelics is just dovetails perfectly into that movement, because psychedelics offers the spiritual and yet makes no moral demands, has no organized religious aspect of it, which people still have a kind of aversion to for the most part.
As Phil Cotnoir says, I believe the new interest in psychedelics is being fueled by a meaning-starved culture. At an academic level, we've been told a story that there is no ultimate story. We have no agency. There is no you beyond your brain. At a cultural level, we've lost the identity and purpose that religion once gave us. But our thirst for more will find an expression somewhere. Perhaps in political stories, in quasi-religious ideologies, or perhaps in the enthralling experience of psychedelics. But can it deliver what it promises? Ashley Lande is an artist and writer who spent years immersed in psychedelics. She told me about her life before psychedelics and how a church-going childhood soon dropped away in her teenage years to be replaced by atheism.
So I am grateful that I had some kind of a foundation, but it wasn't I wouldn't say it was a very strong foundation. I was a very arrogant teenager, and it just seemed fascinating and interesting to pursue something, you know, outside of what I had been raised with, which, as I said, seemed very hollow and shallow to me. And I think I discovered Christopher Hitchens maybe when I was in college, and he just seemed very intelligent and clever to me, very witty. I think the hard certainty of particularly the new atheist really appealed to me. Like I said, as a very arrogant teenager, just that hard certainty really appealed to me. And I guess I'd say the rebelliousness of being an atheist appealed to me at that time.
During college years and hanging out in the artistic scene, it wasn't long before Ashley had the opportunity to try psychedelics.
I had a friend who had some psilocybin mushrooms, and I really didn't know much about psychedelics, much of anything about psychedelics. I remember that I decided to get dressed up in hippie garb, which I thought was appropriate for tripping. And we blended up the mushrooms in a blender with orange juice. And there were 4 of us, and we each drank a portion, and we just had a good time. We stayed in our apartment for the most part. We went outside a little bit. And like I said, it wasn't a revelatory experience. There wasn't really a spiritual dimension to it so much for me at that point. But I did think that it was really fun and magical, and I immediately wanted to do it again.
I asked Ashley to try to put into words what her first trip felt like and how it changed her view of God.
Oh, that first trip wasn't necessarily spiritual. There was an aspect of the transcendent to it. There were lots of visual distortions, lots of auditory distortions. It did open me up to the idea of the transcendent realm, the idea of spirituality. But the irony was that I became open to anything except for Christianity. 6 months to a year after that first psilocybin trip that I had my first LSD trip. And that was actually not what I would call a fun experience at all. It was devastating in many ways. Gosh, how can I describe it? It was existentially and spiritually shattering. But I just immediately wanted more of that. Like I was seeking, in the end, I can see like I was seeking something outside of myself. Like I knew that hard certainty of new atheism, the idea of this like closed dome of a world where there's nothing penetrating from the outside, there's no transcendence, there's no supernatural. It had become unsatisfying. And even that hard certainty of it and lack of mystery had become unsatisfying.
Ashley says that not all her experiences were uniformly positive. She experienced bad trips too. Her first time on LSD was a shattering experience. Like many others, she encountered a kind of ego death as her individual identity was swallowed up, an experience that was both enthralling and terrifying.
After that first LSD trip, that, like I said, was rather devastating and very, it shook me deeply. I remember thinking, I don't know if I'll ever do that again. And then I think it was 2 weeks later that I was starting to call around and look for LSD. So I got to the point where I was doing it by myself, probably at least once, if not twice a week. And I became increasingly disconnected with reality and the world around me. And I think what in my head I was pursuing, and when I look back on my writings from that time, which are strange to read, but I was pursuing some omega point of spiritual enlightenment. And I felt like I was being spurred on by something, I look back at it now, I think it was a spirit or demon, but I just felt so compelled. I felt like it's just around the next corner, like this elusive point of enlightenment. And the irony, of course, was that it kept shrinking away from me and receding into the horizon as I was pursuing it. But yeah, I really felt like I was on this epic cosmic journey, and I was going to reach ultimately this point that I sought. I didn't know what it was. It got to the point where I almost couldn't perceive, or I almost didn't care if I lived or died. And I feel like that is the logical outworking of that worldview, that ultimately, well, nothing really matters if I'm just part of the all in all, and we just get, absorbed back in. There was also some Hinduism light in there as well. Like everything is just cyclical. We're constantly getting absorbed back into the all and getting spit out again, as some reincarnated being. And then we have to go through the cycle of karma again. And when I look back at where I was psychologically, it was rather scary. It was like I no longer valued my life. I no longer valued living. But I really believed, as I said, that I was on this cosmic journey of cosmic proportions. And it was on one hand, it was extremely consequential, but on the other hand, it was of no consequence at all because it didn't really matter. And I think I almost got to the point where I felt like, I remember I don't know where I picked this phrase up. My earth trip is what I called having to function in reality, having to have a job, having to brush my teeth. I called my earth trip. And I got to the point where I was like, I don't want to be on my earth trip anymore. I just want to be absorbed in this other world.
We'll return to the rest of Ashley Lande's story of transcendence, psychedelics and Jesus Christ later, a story she tells in full in her new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever. Her story is just one example of the way psychedelics are popular again. But there are plenty of people warning of the pitfalls too. Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
I don't know about surprised. Psychedelics are one of the most unique experiences that you can have, full stop. And I knew that even before I'd taken them, just from the way that people would speak about them. And so I think it was inevitable that I'd want to know what that felt like. I think there are certain types of knowledge that can only be known through experience.
This is atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor, a regular contributor to this podcast series, describing his own recent experience with psychedelics.
Famously, things like psychedelic experiences, as well as religious experiences, are ineffable. In fact, the ineffability of religious experiences is one of William James's famous characterizations of what makes a religious experience, is this inability to quite put into words what that's like with fresh eyes. In terms of sort of intellectual insights, I suppose the main thing it gifted me, that I think it gifts most people who experience a psychedelic trip, is just a change in perspective. One of the things that I realized in those times when I started to notice more beauty in the world, you can stare at a brick wall and it's like you're watching the most interesting film you've ever seen in your life. But, you look at like a river, or you look at a tree or something, and you think to yourself, gosh, this is so unfathomably beautiful. But the conviction that I had at the time was not so much, gosh, suddenly this tree has just become more beautiful. It was like, it's always been this beautiful. I'm only now somehow realizing it, or it's sort of unlocked something in my brain where now I can finally understand that it's beautiful. But it's not any more beautiful than it was before. That has helped to see beauty in the world in a different way, because when I look at a tree or look at a river or something, I can remember my conviction that the most beautiful I'd ever seen a tree or a river. At the same time as experiencing that, I was fully aware that it looked really no different to how it usually looks. It was like I was just realizing that it's beautiful. But I don't think I actually have anything really interesting to tell you about any kind of insights that I will have received on psychedelics. Firstly, they were extremely personal, but secondly, as I say, they are essentially defined by their ineffability. I don't think I could properly put into words what that was like.
I was intrigued to hear Alex O'Connor's reflections. I'm friends with Alex, and in the past he's told me that despite believing he's open to it, he hasn't felt any sense of God's presence. I've wondered if his psychedelic moment may reframe the God question for him beyond a purely intellectual approach. In fact, you can hear me ask that very question of him on the recent episode of our live Edinburgh debate. Interestingly, Alex also brought up his psychedelic experience with psychiatrist Iain McGilchrist on a recent edition of his podcast Within Reason. We introduced McGilchrist's influential work on brain hemispheres and religious experience in our last episode. Listen out for how he responds to Alex.
I've spoken a few times now on the channel about how I had some experiences on psychedelic drugs, and the thing that psychedelic drugs are famous for doing is just like blowing open not just, what you think about the world, but the way you think about the world. And I wanted to ask you whether you think something like a psychedelic experience could be responsible for like an unlocking of a right brain way of thinking, or perhaps if you're very right-brained, an unlocking of a left way of thinking. And after that, or as well as that, what else could somebody use as a tool to do that unlocking? Because you said, read more philosophy, for example, but I think it's impossible to read continental philosophy and sort of find it useful if you don't already have a bit of a sort of a right brain engagement,
Yes. I want to shelve for the moment. I will come back to it, but I've got nothing interesting to say about it. Psychedelics, I think they're overhyped, and I'm rather cautious about them. I don't deny. I can't deny that some people tell me they've had experiences that have altered their spiritual sense, and if they say so, I'm not contradicting them. I don't find it a very interesting way for this conversation to drift. Partly because I can't contribute anything to it. I don't have negative experiences of these things. I really mean negative. I've not really tried them, but when I have tried them, they've been either very unpleasant or simply haven't worked at all. Mainly, they never work on me. I've had everything, including intravenous ketamine. I've eaten mushrooms. I've had cakes none of this touches me. But what matters to me is really imaginative experience, which I've had very much all my life in response to nature to begin with, and then very much poetry and music and art and so on.
Given how popular psychedelics are in neuroscientific circles at present, it's intriguing how negative McGilchrist's response was to Alex's suggestion. As I've spoken to people myself in researching this topic, I've developed a similar sort of concern to McGilchrist, rather like taking a miracle weight loss drug to make you thin rather than changing your diet and getting more exercise. I fear that psychedelics are being used as a shortcut to transcendence rather than going through the longer and harder route of training our imagination and intellect to seek beauty and meaning in the everyday world. And that's not the only danger. What sort of spiritual Pandora's box are we actually opening up? Could it be more than just brain chemistry we're meddling with? I asked Phil Cotnoir. You've got the folks like Sam Harris who might say, well, all this is a physical effect on your very complex mind and your neurons. And yeah, it can be good, it can be bad, but it's just a physical thing. It sounds like you do actually think there's something genuinely spiritual happening when someone takes a chemical and it kind of, yes, affects their physical brain. What do you think potentially, I guess you're kind of going to have to be guessing here exactly, but what do you think is happening? What are you opening yourself up to, do you think, when you take something like LSD or some kind of psychedelic?
That's such a good question, and I fear to tread there a little bit. I think we need to ask first, what is the human brain? What is the mind? Is the mind the same thing as the brain? However you answer that question actually sets the framework for how you will answer what psychedelics do. To put my cards on the table, I don't think that the brain is the sum total of our minds, or that our minds are reducible to our physical brains. So if our brains are more of, somehow, mysteriously, I don't know how this works, but they are a way for us to be in touch with created reality and spiritual reality too. It's our seat of perception. And so psychedelics do something very powerful to the brain in terms of opening up that perception. And so you have non-Christians and Christians basically saying it's the same thing, those who are non-materialists. And that's interesting to have agreement among people who would disagree on a lot, who would say, well, when you take these substances, you do open yourself up in a way that we are not regularly opened up in normal waking life. You open yourself up to a realm or a reality in which spiritual things, spiritual beings exist. Now, how does a substance do that? I don't know. And is there a dosage issue there? Yeah, because you could take a little bit and your perception of your world will stay more or less the same, but altered, and some people do microdosing, which is taking so little that there's no real effect visually, or you can go about your day, but it sort of, according to them, alters their mood. So it's a little bit more like an antidepressant. And then there's the heroic dose, there's a full-blown psychedelic experience where really, even if you have your eyes open, you're in another place and you're perceiving another reality. The question is, what is this place? What are they experiencing? What are they seeing? And interestingly, there's people, really trying to figure that out, which I don't know how I feel about that. But there's a study in your home country. There's a Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. I believe there's some affiliation with Oxford. And they have found a way to basically give people DMT, which is one of the more powerful psychedelics, dimethyltryptamine, and usually it's a 15-minute experience, but they found a way to give it to people intravenously so they can extend the experience. And so they're having people go into what they call the DMT realm, and they're keeping them there, and then this is in their own words, they're mapping out the DMT realm. So they're going as sort of explorers to this place to see what they find. And, you have really intriguing testimonies coming out of people who will take DMT in at separate times and then have testimony of the exact same experience or the exact same entity or the exact same space. And again, I don't know what to do with that. But it's pretty intriguing.
What are your concerns about the side effects as well? Because obviously many people are saying this is wonderful, it's helped me to treat my mental health problems, my PTSD, whatever. But from what I read in the article, there are also some concerns you have about other possible side effects.
I think we can frame these in a couple of different categories. In any kind of movement like this, you've got people who are looking to make an easy buck. So you've got con men, you've got abusers. Anyone who's leading someone on a psychedelic journey is in a position of tremendous power and influence. You have young women from the West, listening to Will Smith or Megan Fox say that this is the best experience of their life. They're booking trips to Brazil or Ecuador to have these experiences in the jungle somewhere in a hut far from anywhere. And there's some of them sadly are coming back with stories of being abused or mistreated or just conned out of their money. So you've got that. There's nothing particularly supernatural about that. You have the bad trip. Bad trips are something that happen regularly, and which is sort of not talked about at the front end of this whole discussion usually. But once you talk to people who regularly take psychedelics, they do deal with bad trips, and some of them can be really tremendously horrendous. You can find a number of testimonies of people encountering just the worst horrors that you can imagine, and also entities, beings, personalities. I don't know what people want to call them. Machine elves is what Terence McKenna called them. These sort of beings and entities that one encounters when one is deep into the psychedelic experience. Many of which present as benevolent, but many people come back with stories of being attacked and being abused and encountering profound evil there. And so it's a real mixed bag. It's a place, an experience which is impossible to control. And so there's that danger. And connected to that, if we look at the testimonies of people who come out of those experiences in those communities into Christianity, who encounter the truth claims of the Bible, they put their faith in Christ, and then they look back and interpret those experiences in that past, pretty uniformly, those people say, that was part of a web of spiritual deception that was being woven in my life. And I talked to one woman, Amanda, about this, and she took psychedelics at a time when she was depressed and she was a mess. Her marriage had fallen apart. She was a single mother, and she met this beautiful, powerful being flowing with feminine energy. And this being became her spirit guide and gave her wisdom and helped her. And at first, it was really a turnaround for her, but pretty soon it wore off, and she needed more. She needed to return, and real life was still real life, and the struggles there were still real. And ultimately, her pursuit of these spiritual experiences was disconnecting her from her real life and her children and her responsibilities. And someone eventually shared the gospel with her, and she turned to Christ, and just looked back on that and just saw that, in her case, this was not of God.
Ashley Lande told me that during her period immersed in psychedelics, she came to believe in the reality of spiritual evil, even developing a pet name for the devil, Papa Diabolis. One night in particular stayed with her.
That night really shook me up because I was not on drugs that night. And I was lying in my bed and I saw an apparition in the corner of my room. It was just like a dark column of smoke that was kind of swirling around, but it was substantial. And I thought to myself, okay, that's not really there. I'm just going to go back to sleep. My drug-addled brain is just producing this apparition that's not really there. And it was just interesting. As much as I was enmeshed in this world and I loved it in a way, like I couldn't really handle the idea that I was having visual hallucinations while I was not on drugs. So I told myself it's not real. And then I had this little terrier mix, and he stood up and he bristled and he started barking straight at it. And we were I was on the second floor of an apartment. So it's not like there was, it was in the middle of the night. It's not like there was someone walking by. There wasn't any noise from the apartments above me or below me. And that really freaked me out. But I absolutely think there is a spiritual reality to it. It's not just chemicals, assailing our brains. Although I think the fact that there is a chemical reality to it does not negate the spiritual reality. And I do think that makes it really dangerous, because I feel like people always get more than they've bargained for, that these drugs are taking us places that we're not intended to go to, at least not in our, fallen state. So yeah, I absolutely think that they were real spiritual experiences in a sense.
Today, a certain 1960s-era romanticism tends to get associated with psychedelics, from the kitsch comedy of Austin Powers' Flower Power to apocryphal stories about how the Beatles were inspired to write their songs. But Ashley Lande told me that there are just as many horror stories that could be told.
Brian Wilson, he has said in interviews that he thinks LSD is a really bad drug and that he doesn't think anyone should ever take it. And he did have pre-existing mental illness before he took it. I remember, I need to look this up, just see. I was thinking about this the other day to verify this, but someone told me that the first time he took acid, he laid on a bed and cried for 6 hours and then got up and wrote California Girls, which doesn't sound true at all. But he was really broken after, and he did have some things, like he had a manager who was abusing him, but he was really, really kind of psychologically broken by using psychedelics. So that's another example that people don't really talk about. And I feel like we have kind of lost the cultural lore of so-called acid casualties. I intentionally sought out as many old hippies that had turned Christian as I could. And I talked to, probably between 10 and 15 people like that. And every single one of them, without exception, every single one of them knew at least one or two people who had not come back psychologically from psychedelic use. And I thought that was really interesting. And I feel like now that we're experiencing this resurgence in use, people will say, oh, it was just like Nixon and the war on drugs. That's what, these bureaucratic killjoys, that's why everything got shut down. But no, it's they really did damage a lot of people, and a lot of people really didn't come back.
To be clear, the dangers associated with psychedelics aren't the same as the dangers of highly addictive Class A drugs such as heroin and crystal meth. Nevertheless, there are plenty of cautionary tales if you look for them. I recently stumbled across one in the autobiography of British comedian Bob Mortimer. He describes the one and only occasion he took LSD as a shy, introverted student, resulting in a day-long terrifying ordeal of hallucinations and visions, which he says triggered a state of permanent depression lasting for several years into his adult life. These are just a few of the physiological and spiritual dangers potentially lurking behind psychedelics. Yet at the same time, I do feel conflicted. Today, psychedelics are, for some people at least, breaking down their atheist materialist assumptions and have even opened up a path to Christian faith for individuals like Shawn Ryan. Likewise, when I interviewed Mikhaila Peterson, daughter of psychologist Jordan Peterson, about her journey to faith on The Big Conversation from Premier Unbelievable, she told me that she felt psychedelics had positively impacted her journey.
Okay, I've had this conversation a number of times with my husband, as you can imagine. I was like, oh, I don't think they're evil. I talked about it a bit on my channel, and I have people who are like, oh no, they, make you see demons. And then it's like, well, that's whatever they did to me, I think opened my mind to the possibility of God. So plus, why are they on Earth? Wouldn't you argue that maybe God put them there? Like shrooms? Or were they put there by the devil? I don't know. I think that they can be unbelievably beneficial for people. I think that they can probably be used as a replacement for God by people, which is not a good idea at all. So I think people who are really looking for a sense of meaning will gravitate towards psychedelics to fill that void. They don't work like that. and people don't have good experiences like that, and they should not be used like that. So I think you have to be really careful with them.
I asked Phil Cotnoir about how he squares the concerns he lays out in his article, The Coming Psychedelic Moment, with the fact that some people have found God through psychedelics. So what do you then do with the fact that there are people who would say, maybe people who came through the 60s and 70s, you know, counterculture as hippies, but found Christ, who said, it was actually psychedelics that opened me up to the spiritual realm, and I probably wouldn't have got to being a Christian had I not gone through that experience?
Well, God draws straight with crooked lines, right? He drew me to himself through all of my wanderings and my sin and rebellion. I mean, I love hearing those stories. I love seeing how God graciously pulls people to himself from the four corners of human experience, from the incredibly cerebral professor thinking through the philosophical questions and ending at a belief in the unmoved mover who sent his son to die for him. And just as I love the testimony of the person who says that they're totally high on ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms, and they have an encounter of Christ who tells them that what they're doing is stupid and foolish, and that they need to turn to him. And we do hear those stories. So, I think God has a prerogative to do what he will. And I understand that, if I get all upset and worried and tell people to not do psychedelics, that's not really going to have any impact. I think I do want the church to understand what we're dealing with and some of the things going on in a measured, non-hysterical way. But the larger movements we see in our culture, I think, are going to play themselves out, and I think it's part of the larger re-enchantment that's going on. And I'm hopeful, if we think of it as a kind of new paganism, right, as a kind of way to really experience in a visceral way the spiritual world, and to experience the world as spiritual, my hope and prayer is that for many of these people, they will come to the greatest pagan tradition of them all, which is to convert to Christianity.
I wonder if you could finally, Phil, just reflect on what I thought was a really, really interesting closing paragraph, where you talk about the death of Aldous Huxley in the 1960s. It's well known that he died on the same day as C.S. Lewis and JFK, funnily enough. But tell us about what happened on Huxley's deathbed and how you kind of contrast that with Lewis's experience in his own life and death.
Yeah, I came across this anecdote about Aldous Huxley on his deathbed. He was famously a huge proponent of psychedelics, an early adopter, you might say. And his words that I quote there are, "It's never enough. It's never enough. Never enough love, never enough." That there's, I don't know his story well enough to really interpret that and know exactly what he means. But I think we can safely say that outside of Christ, ultimately it's never enough, whatever it is that you're turning to, including psychedelics. And C.S. Lewis I use to provide the counterexample of a man who earlier in his life did explore that interesting stream of British occultism, which was quite a fascinating movement in the 1800s and early 1900s. But he eventually turns to Christ and finds there the source of his inconsolable longing. And of course, I'm just a huge fan of his writing and his thinking, which I do, like many, believe is more relevant than ever for our modern day. And C.S. Lewis has a line where he says, the long, sad story, I'm paraphrasing, it's a long, sad story of man trying to find anything but God that will satisfy him. And I just think that beautifully captures ultimately the result of this new wave of psychedelic renaissance, which is sweeping across our culture. I do believe that ultimately it will end up being not enough. And it will be just one more way that people try to find ultimate answers and satisfaction outside of Christ.
As we heard earlier, artist Ashley Lande believed she had discovered the path to enlightenment when she started tripping on mushrooms and LSD on a regular basis. However, she told me that it was after meeting her husband and starting a family that she first began to question the path she was on.
So my husband and I met at our acid dealer's house. So he was just as into acid as I was. So we had our first child, and I think that really made me start thinking about the logical outworkings of the philosophies that I was embracing. We had a friend who gave us a children's book that was expressing in a very fundamental childlike way these different ideas about, and it said, I remember this book, it said, I am every person I meet. I am the puppy across the street. And I really started thinking about that. And to hear it expressed, not being couched in this like eloquent philosophical language, the way that someone like Alan Watts could do it, and to hear it just expressed in this really childlike tone, it seemed sinister. And especially when I looked at my own child and thought, like, I don't want him to just be reabsorbed into the all and have no retention of his individual himness, because he was so precious to me. And so that really made me start kind of second guessing, the philosophies and New Age beliefs that I had been embracing. And another big part of it was I had a friend, a childhood friend who I kind of reconnected with, and she had remained a Christian through high school, college. And I remember thinking the first email I got back from her, I thought it was awfully hokey. She was talking about God did this and God did that and God, and I was like, okay, whatever. And but we reconnected, and since we both had children now, we started having some play dates here and there. And I remember when I was with her, often I would go off on a tear about whatever, I don't know, random New Age idea that I was exploring at the moment. And sometimes I was reading some book, I don't even remember what it was now, that was like an alternative explanation of what was actually going on in the major Bible stories. And so Carrie would always who was my childhood friend, she would always just very gently counter what I was saying. She would say, well, the Bible says this, this is what the Bible says. And I would just kind of inwardly roll my eyes and move on. But I think that really had an effect on me looking back. And she and her husband had a little precious 2-year-old girl named Joella. And all of a sudden she started getting sick. She was running a fever for a couple weeks, and she ended up getting diagnosed with leukemia. And it was only 3 weeks from diagnosis to her passing. And just horribly tragic, devastating event. And I remember going to her funeral service and I was also newly pregnant at the time with my daughter, and just feeling like, just so like this event I can't find a way to shoehorn this into my philosophies. Like I can't believe that Joella has been reabsorbed into the all, I don't have a way to fit this. Like my worldview does not have a place for this level of tragedy and this level of sadness and this level of suffering. And it also really affected, and so that was, kind of shook me up. And it was also very moving to see Carrie and her husband not be completely destroyed. Like I think now of those contrasting pairs of adjectives that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 4, like struck down but not destroyed. And so that really had an effect on me, because I thought, if this happened to me, I would be just utterly annihilated. I don't know what I would do. And so those two things together really, and it was almost like I almost felt like Carrie was comforting me at her own child's funeral. And I think that really had an effect on me, that I can't handle this, but for some reason there is something that is sustaining her that can.
So this obviously had quite a profound impact on you, this friendship and example. In tragic circumstances, obviously, you got to the point of actually trying church again with your husband. Kind of what fueled that particular decision?
So he started getting interested in Christianity. He had been seeing a psychologist for a season, and because he was just feeling like he was having trouble controlling his anger generally. And the psychologist challenged him to quit smoking weed every day and to try going to church. And so he rose to the challenge. And it's interesting, my husband will even say now, he never really had a bad trip, like a really bad trip. He never had one. But I think he also was getting to a point of just feeling burnt out on psychedelics and what they had to offer him. Like he felt like the well had run dry, and he was looking for something more. And so he started attending a Christian church near where we lived. And I said, no, absolutely not. I am not going to a Christian church. Like I said, I was kicking against the goats for a long time. And it's interesting, like I was at a point of spiritual despair and desperation. And yet I still resisted so hard. And I think it was in my 8th month of pregnancy with my daughter, I finally agreed to go to a church service with him. And I remember I just started weeping I insisted that we sit near the back, and I was thinking like, I might be here, but I'm not one of these people. Like I'm not really participating in this. And I just like the emotion overcame me, and I started weeping during the worship. And I was, it was befuddling because I thought, I don't even know what these lyrics mean. I didn't understand if someone had tried to explain to me what Jesus did. I didn't even know what it meant. It was so foreign to me. Despite having grown up with some of that container and some of that terminology, I just didn't understand it. But I just found myself overcome with emotion. But even after that, it was somewhat easy to rationalize and say like, well, I'm pregnant, I'm hormonal. But I did agree to keep going with him. And after we had our daughter, I remember the people at that church were so kind to us. They brought us food. They came and visited us. And I was really touched by that. That's something that I had not ever experienced in the New Age psychedelic community, which, you'll find plenty of nice, generous people, but there just isn't that tight-knit sense of community in place, and that sense of love and service. I had never experienced that before in any community, New Age, yoga, psychedelic that I had been in. And so that really had an effect on me.
So this was all, I suppose, breaking down some of the barriers and preconceptions. I guess, was there a point at which you recognized that what you were looking for on the psychedelics wasn't going to be found there? And what was the point at which you realized actually the thing you were looking for was in the last place you expected it? This story of Jesus and so on.
Yeah. So I remember I had an experience, and the timeline is kind of murky to me. I can't remember if this is when I was pregnant or, I remember I was sitting on our front porch, and I just felt a voice say to me, it's time to quit LSD. Like it's time to give up LSD. It's time to stop. And I remember I started weeping because the thought that just naturally occurred to me was, but LSD is my friend. Like LSD is my teacher. LSD is my God. I don't know that I thought it in those exact terms at the time, but LSD was my God. That was, I didn't trust my God, certainly not anymore, but LSD was certainly my God. But I knew the voice, and I recognize it now as the voice of God. Like I know, even then I knew it was right and it was true. But like I said, I was still kicking against the goats, and I thought, then I got it in my head, like, well, maybe the problem is that LSD is a chemical. Like LSD is a chemical. It's made in a laboratory. And maybe the problem is that I need to turn to natural psychedelics again. And so I decided I was going to grow my own mushrooms. And my husband was able to get some spores from someone he knew. And so I undertook with vigor, I undertook this process of of growing mushrooms. And it took, I can't remember how long it took, several weeks anyway, a couple months. And I thought, I prayed over this. I don't know what my prayers would have been, some kind of Sanskrit thing I learned from yoga. But I prayed over them, and I thought, I am infusing them with the right energy, and therefore I'm going to have a good trip. Like, this is going to be a great experience. I'm infusing them with good vibes. And I remember finally the harvest came, and my husband and I, we arranged for babysitting for our kids, at my parents' house. Sorry to my mom. And we took the mushrooms, and as soon as they started coming on, and I remember it was really strong, I just had this feeling like, oh no, just this sinking feeling of like, here we go again. It's the same place, the same rut in the road, the same, like it is, I'm going downhill. It's a bad trip again. And I remember just laying on the floor. I lay down on the floor, and I said to my husband, like, I really am dying this time. Like, I'm dying. I'm dying this time. And I said, does anything mean anything? And he said, yes, everything has meaning. And I started crying. And that trip was, it was up and down and up and down and all over the place. And I remember at one point, I felt like I was chasing after God. I was pacing around our house, and I felt like I was chasing after God, and I just kept missing him. And there was such a sorrowful, like his robes were whisking around the corner, and there was such a sorrowful feeling in it. And there was a sorrow for me too. And like, this didn't work. My foolproof plan, it didn't work. And I was devastated, but I was also, after that, I was fully ready to move on. And I just knew that it was over.
As you left that world behind, how did you find your way to embracing Christian faith? I guess this was all still very new to you. There was a lot you had to kind of shed in order to step into something new.
After that experience of first attending a church, and then especially after that mushroom trip, I started thinking, like, maybe there is something to this Jesus person, maybe I should give him a try. And I think at first though, I was still thinking like, okay, like this is, Christianity is a lens through which I can understand this perennial philosophy. Like, it is not the reality itself, but it's a lens through which it can be filtered. And it was really profound for me when I realized, like, oh no, like the claim here is that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Like, the claim here is like, this is not another in the grab bag of, different religions that I can kind of pick and choose from. Like, the claim here is like the Trinity is the ground of reality. Like, the Trinity has always existed, will always exist. Like, it is, Jesus is how we know what love is at all. And that was really, I feel like profound isn't even a strong enough word because for so long I had just had this kind of bespoke pick and choose religion where it was like whatever suited me at the time, and just realizing like, no, this is not subject to me. I am subject to Christ. Like, I am subject to God. And that was really, really profound.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll.
And I also remember Carrie, my friend who had lost her daughter, she shared a hymn with me, It Is Well With My Soul. Obviously a very well-known hymn. I don't think I had ever heard it before, though. And she said that it really ministered to them while they were grieving Joella. And at least in the, the most intense period, the aftermath, I don't think you ever stopped grieving a child, but just in the intense aftermath of her death, it had really ministered to them. And so I put it on a playlist and kind of forgot about it. And there was one spring afternoon, I was playing outside with my children on the porch, and that song, I had that playlist on, that song came on, and and I hadn't really even been listening to the music up until that point. And there was something that just grabbed me and captured my attention.
Christ has regarded.
And I started really listening to what it was saying. And all of a sudden, I just felt like something clicked into place as far as understanding what Jesus had done and what Jesus had done for me. And also like the weight of my sin, that he completely took it away. And I also fully understood for the first time the weight of my sin.
My soul.
That day sitting on the porch, it was just so profound for me it was like I could acknowledge that yes, I am foundationally broken in some way. I am sinful. And reality is too. Like, I didn't have to keep pretending that I just needed to do more yoga poses or meditate more or whatever to reach this point of wholeness that I could feel deep down inside was not attainable. So, and it was also a profound relief to realize that not only did I not have to save myself through yoga, through meditation, through doing psychedelics, that I literally could not save myself. Like it was not possible. I utterly needed Jesus. And so that night when my husband got home from work, we still had some new age kish floating around our house and, religious icons from Hinduism and Buddhism. And I remember when he got home that night, I said, all this needs to go. I'm done with all of it. And I didn't know how he would react to that. And he just said, yes, yeah, you're right. It does need to go. And so, we put it all in a trash bag and got rid of it.
I encourage you to read Ashley Lande's story in full in her new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, available for pre-order now. There's a link with today's show notes. And you can hear our conversation in full on the Maybe God podcast. Over the past few episodes, we've explored consciousness, determinism, the brain, and the possibility that we really do have a soul, and how an increasing number of people are rejecting a purely material account of mind and meaning. Psychedelics are another fascinating window into the fact that we're more than a brain on legs. I'm convinced that there is a spiritual reality that psychedelics tap into, but just as we barely understand the nature of our own mind, we know very little about the nature of the spiritual entities we may invite into our lives when we turn on, tune in, and drop out. Notwithstanding their potential medicinal use or the fact that some people have found their way to God via psychedelics, I want to state categorically that, in my view, psychedelics are a false substitute for the real thing. But the boom in interest around psychedelics is a reminder that people are hungering and thirsting for real spiritual experience. One might ask whether the modern church has failed to meet that need since people are searching for it elsewhere. Arguably, in the wake of the Enlightenment and in answer to the intellectual challenges posed by new atheism, the church may have overcorrected in adopting a rational, left-brained approach at the expense of the intuition, mystery, and spiritual experiences afforded by the right brain. We are storytelling creatures. We all need a story to live by. A key reason Ashley Lande was drawn to the psychedelic world was because it provided an escape from humdrum existence, the materialist story of reality that denies any purpose beyond biology and chemistry. Psychedelics offered a cosmic drama that she could be part of. The problem was she couldn't live in both worlds. Her Earth trip was pale and uninteresting by comparison. But I believe Christianity offers the greatest cosmic drama we could hope for, and one that is rooted in this world. Our Earth trip can be filled with transcendence too. Having been starved of meaning, purpose, and a story to live by, the West is, I believe, ready to recover the story of Christianity and its central protagonist's claim to be the personal embodiment of the way, the truth, and the life. Throughout this series, I've tried to spell out the ways we may be seeing that happen intellectually in culture, history, and science. But perhaps more importantly, telling that story again will become easier, more natural, as we begin to overcome the false dichotomy of the left and right brain, of scientist and storyteller, of reason and imagination. I see it already happening in the stories of the heterodox thinkers pushing against the prevailing paradigms, and the converts finding God as they reject the machine of materialism to explore the meaning of a great mind behind it all. These are all early signs that people are giving themselves permission to live in a different story. It's the story of the one described as the Logos, the Word, who created a world out of love, placed humans at the center of it, and when it all went wrong, entered the story himself to redeem and restore the creation he'd made. It is a grand story that declares that every individual story matters. Far from being one more product of a mindless, purposeless universe headed towards oblivion, we have each been offered an integral role in a cosmic drama. What you do with your part is up to you, but you are nevertheless invited into a story that is being woven through time and space, a story in which you are intended, purposed, and loved. This is the story that shaped and fed us for almost 2 millennia. Its power has not gone away, even if it's only often dimly remembered now. But when people do embrace it today, it continues to transform individual lives and whole civilizations in turn. What if the tide is due to turn? In the coming final act of this season of the podcast, I'll explain why I think we may see it happen in our own generation. The surprising rebirth of belief in God is underway, and we may yet live to see the rebirth of our culture in the process. You've been listening to The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, telling the story of how new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Material from The Unbelievable Show was used by permission of Premier. Visit premierunbelievable.com for full shows, or today's show notes for links to all archive materials used in this episode. It Is Well With My Soul was performed by Jonathan Ogden. And just to remind you, this podcast series is also a book. You can read the first chapter for free when you join my newsletter at justinbrierley.com, where you can also order the book or get a signed copy. Supporting via Patreon or tax-deductible giving from the USA will give you early access to new episodes of the podcast and access to bonus content. Find out more and how to support my efforts to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world at justinbrierley.com. The links are with today's show. Coming up next time.
And I walked all the way back to the back door of the church to leave. And I opened the door, and this is where, at the moment where I had one foot out the door, there was a big blast of chill that came in my stomach, going up in my chest, and grabbed me by the throat. And I was frozen on the doorstep with goosebumps all over, and I heard myself thinking, this is ridiculous, I need to figure this out.
Confessions of a French atheist. We'll hear the surprising story of how God hijacked Guillaume Bignon's quest to disprove Christianity. That's a bonus episode before we return to our documentary format for the final act of this season of the podcast. Today's episode was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and support from the Jerusalem Trust, editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. You can find links to the book and all our featured guests with the show notes. Please do subscribe to this podcast. Do rate and review us. Tell others to. Share it on your social media. It all helps others to find it. And you can get that next episode 2 weeks early when you support now at justinbrierley.com. Again, the link is with today's show. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.